There is a moment in politics when loyalty doesn't shatter loudly. It thins. It becomes porous. Words that were once automatic suddenly hesitate before leaving the mouth, and when they finally do, they land heavier than a declaration of war. This morning had that texture, not the sound of a rupture, but the feeling that a seam somewhere deep inside the system had finally given way. For years, everything followed a familiar geometry. Roles were clear, movements predictable. One voice absorbed the heat while another stayed safely behind the curtain, nodding, reinforcing, translating chaos into something donors could tolerate and institutions could survive. That arrangement worked longer than most people expected, until it didn't. And what's unsettling is not that someone spoke out, but how they did it. Calmly, procedurally. As if the words had been rehearsed not for television, but for a room where decisions are made quietly and consequences are understood in advance. It began with a single term that is rarely tolerated in closed circles of power. Not outrage, not regret. A technical word. A word that implies process, responsibility, and failure without emotion. When that word was attached to a recent operation, everyone else was defending. Something shifted. Because calling something a failure is not a moral judgment. It's a systems diagnosis, and systems do not forgive diagnoses lightly. What made it worse was the context. This wasn't said in public, not at first. It wasn't meant for the base or even for critics. It was said where the money listens, where fear is measured in balance sheets, not polling numbers. And the room, by all accounts, was not hostile. It was anxious. Supply lines disrupted, portfolios bleeding, reputations corroding faster than anyone planned for. They didn't want rhetoric. They wanted assurance that someone still understood the controls. And then came the sentence that doesn't sound dramatic until you unpack it. A sentence framed as responsibility, as intervention, as necessity. Not, we are adjusting, not, the president has asked, but a quiet assertion of action spoken in the first person with no superior referenced above it. At that point, the room reportedly went still, because everyone there understood what that formulation means in institutional language. It means the chain of command has bent, or been bypassed. This is where people usually rush to call it a gaffe or a leak or a misunderstanding. That's comforting. It keeps the story small. But nothing about this was accidental. Discipline like that doesn't slip. It signals, especially when spoken to an audience that knows how to read between the lines, especially when phones are visible and no one is asked to put them away. Outside that room, the official machinery kept moving as if nothing had happened. Schedules remained intact. Statements stayed on script, but inside the residence, the reaction was anything but procedural. Anger, yes, but also something colder. The realization that some levers cannot be pulled back once they've been touched. You can exile aides, you can close doors, you can flood the airwaves. But there are roles in this system that cannot simply be removed. And when one of those roles begins speaking like a corrective mechanism rather than a subordinate, the architecture itself comes into question. What complicates this further is timing. This did not occur in isolation. Markets are jumpy. Allies are impatient. Domestic scenes meant to project strength have instead triggered discomfort in places the coalition can't afford to alienate. Each event alone might be survivable. Together, they form a pattern. And patterns are what financiers, bureaucrats, and foreign governments react to. Not intentions, not loyalty. Patterns. So the question isn't why someone chose this moment to speak differently. The more disturbing question is how long this recalibration has been underway without anyone outside the room noticing. Because when a system reaches the point where internal actors start preemptively stepping in, it usually means something else has already stopped functioning. And they don't announce that part out loud. They usually keep quiet about it. At this point, the story stops being about personalities and starts being about mechanics. About what happens when confidence drains out of the center and quietly pools somewhere else. About what authority looks like when it's no longer declared but inferred. And about how quickly everyone adjusts once they sense where gravity is moving. And this is where the main thing begins. Because once that sentence was spoken, it couldn't be unheard. And whatever still appears solid on the surface is now carrying weight it was never designed to bear. What followed did not look like a rebellion. That is the mistake most people make when they try to interpret moments like this. Real breaks inside systems rarely resemble confrontation. They resemble rerouting. The existing pathways stay in place, but attention begins to flow elsewhere. Calls get returned faster. Memos get answered out of sequence. Certain offices suddenly become quieter while others acquire a low, constant hum of activity that wasn't there before. The intervention language mattered because it activated something deeper than politics. It signaled continuity where volatility had become expensive, not morally expensive, operationally expensive, and that distinction is crucial. Institutions can tolerate almost any ideology. What they cannot tolerate is unpredictability that disrupts coordination. Once that threshold is crossed, the system does not argue. It adapts. The people in that room did not need persuasion. They had already done the math. What they needed was a mechanism, someone who could plausibly absorb authority without detonating the structure. And this is where the design flaw becomes visible. The role that was meant to reinforce loyalty also happens to be the only constitutional position capable of acting as a stabilizer without triggering an immediate legitimacy crisis. That dual function was never supposed to be tested under this level of stress. But now it is. Notice what was not said in that exchange. There was no appeal to values, no denunciation, no emotional distancing. Instead, there was a focus on protocols, reviews, containment. The language of triage. That is how systems talk when they are no longer debating direction, only survival. When someone says they are stopping the bleeding, it implies an injury everyone else has stopped describing. From that moment on, every actor began recalibrating. Not publicly, privately. Career officials do not wait for formal transfers of power. They anticipate them. They look for consistency, not charisma. They listen for which voice speaks in verbs rather than slogans. And once they hear it, they adjust their tempo accordingly. Files slow down in one direction and accelerate in another. Decisions that once required force now require patience. This is how authority migrates without ever announcing that it has moved. The market response was not ideological. It never is. Algorithms do not care about loyalty or betrayal, they care about variance. When volatility appears to be capped, even temporarily, they reward it. A minor rally is not confidence, it is relief. Relief that someone, somewhere seems to understand how fragile the machine has become, and that relief sends a message far louder than any press release. At the same time, external actors took notice. Not because they were informed, but because they recognized the signal. Foreign governments are exceptionally sensitive to shifts in internal coherence. They watch for inconsistencies in messaging, delays in response, overlapping authorities. When those appear, they begin testing alternative channels. Quietly. A call placed here instead of there. A message routed around a ministry rather than through it. These are not breaches of protocol. They are bets. And once those bets are placed, they compound. The original center finds itself increasingly isolated, not through hostility, but through irrelevance. Orders still come out. Statements are still issued. But compliance becomes conditional, deferred, reviewed. At this point, the system usually fails, not because someone pulls the plug, but because no one is willing to be the last person holding a collapsing line. What makes this moment particularly unstable is that no formal line has been crossed. Everything remains technically intact, titles unchanged, offices occupied, ceremonies observed. But functionally, the axis has tilted. The question is no longer who is in charge. The question is who everyone is preparing for, because preparation is the only honest indicator of where power is expected to reside. And this is where discomfort sets in, because once preparation begins, reversal becomes almost impossible. You can punish disloyalty, you can escalate rhetoric, you can flood the space with noise, but you cannot force confidence back into a structure that has already begun hedging against you. The system does not rebel, it ensures itself. What we are watching now is not an overthrow, it is a provisional reallocation, a temporary solution that has a way of becoming permanent once enough people adjust their behavior around it. And the most dangerous aspect of that process is how invisible it looks until it is complete. Because by the time it feels obvious, the point of no return is usually already behind you. By the time consequences surface, the decision has already been made. Not voted on, not announced. Made in behavior, in routing, in hesitation, in the quiet refusal to act without a secondary confirmation that no one admits they are waiting for. This is the phase where systems stop pretending they are neutral and start revealing what they are protecting. From here on, every outcome carries risk. If authority continues to split, paralysis sets in. Agencies begin protecting themselves rather than executing directives. Orders are interpreted narrowly. Timelines stretch. Responsibility dissolves into committees and reviews. Nothing breaks spectacularly, it just stops responding the way it used to. And when that happens at the center, pressure migrates outward. Markets price in uncertainty. Allies hedge. Adversaries probe. Not aggressively at first, just enough to see whether resistance still arrives on time. If, instead, the provisional center hardens into a de facto one, a different danger appears. Legitimacy lags behind function. Decisions may become more coherent, but they rest on an unspoken arrangement that cannot be defended openly. That creates a permanent vulnerability. Every action taken under that logic invites the same question, never answered aloud: by whose authority? The longer that question hangs unanswered, the more corrosive it becomes. Inside the political structure, this produces a quiet sorting. Some align early, betting on continuity and access. Others wait, hoping ambiguity preserves optionality. A few resist, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of precedent. Because if power can migrate this way once, it can do so again. And next time, it may not move toward stability. The public layer feels this last, not as a single event, but as a drift. Messages lose coherence. Justifications arrive late. Crises are framed as misunderstandings rather than decisions. Trust erodes not through outrage, but through fatigue. People sense that something is being managed above their line of sight and that they are not meant to know the terms. At this stage, reversal is theoretical. You could imagine decisive action restoring clarity. You could imagine reconciliation. You could imagine a clean break. But systems rarely choose the dramatic option when a quieter one is available. They choose the path that minimizes immediate shock, even if it maximizes long-term distortion. Especially when no one wants to be responsible for triggering the visible collapse. So the danger now is not explosion, it is normalization. A new equilibrium where ambiguity is accepted, where authority is inferred rather than exercised, where everyone acts as if the arrangement is temporary while behaving as if it will last. That is the point of no return. Not because it is irreversible, but because reversing it would require admitting what has already happened. And that admission is the one thing this system is built to avoid. What deepens the risk is how quickly secondary structures begin adjusting themselves around this ambiguity. Legal teams quietly rewrite their internal guidance. Compliance departments start flagging decisions not for legality but for political survivability. Intelligence briefings become narrower, more selective, designed to avoid forcing anyone to choose a side too early. Information itself becomes cautious. And when information becomes cautious, decision-making becomes blind. History shows that this phase produces a specific pathology. Everyone assumes someone else will act first. The legislature waits for the executive to stabilize. The executive waits for markets to calm. Markets wait for signals from abroad. Foreign governments wait for confirmation that agreements still hold. Each delay reinforces the next. Momentum drains not because of resistance, but because initiative has nowhere safe to land. This is also where informal power brokers become disproportionately influential. Advisors without titles, donors without visibility, former officials whose phone calls still get answered. They do not issue commands. They frame options. They whisper what outcomes will be tolerated and which ones will be punished quietly later when memories are shorter. Their influence grows precisely because formal authority has become brittle. The system leans on them because it no longer trusts itself. There is another consequence that rarely gets discussed openly. Once authority becomes conditional, accountability dissolves. Decisions can always be attributed to process. Failures can always be blamed on miscommunication. No single actor carries the full weight of responsibility, which means no single actor feels compelled to resolve the tension decisively. This is how crises stretch. This is how emergencies become background noise. Externally, this uncertainty invites recalibration. Allies begin drafting contingency plans that assume delayed responses. Defense commitments are interpreted more conservatively. Economic agreements gain exit clauses that were never intended to be used. None of this is hostile, it is rational. But rational hedging, when multiplied across enough actors, becomes a structural downgrade of influence. Power is not lost in one move. It is discounted incrementally until it no longer commands automatic deference. Inside the country, institutions designed to be neutral start behaving strategically. Courts become more procedural, regulators more cautious, law enforcement more literal. Each actor seeks cover in technicality. "We followed protocol" replaces "we exercised judgment." This is not cowardice, it is self-preservation in an environment where the future hierarchy is unclear. At this point, the most dangerous illusion is stability. The absence of immediate chaos can be mistaken for resolution. But what has actually happened is that tension has been redistributed rather than released. Pressure that once sat visibly at the top now permeates the structure. It shows up in delays, in contradictory statements, in the growing gap between what is said and what is done. And once that gap becomes routine, the system enters a fragile calm, one that looks manageable until it is tested by a shock that cannot be deferred. A security incident, a financial rupture, a foreign provocation that demands a single, unequivocal response. In that moment, ambiguity stops being an asset and becomes a liability. The question that remains unanswered is not who will prevail, but whether the system still remembers how to converge. Because coordination is a muscle, and muscles that are not used do not remain strong indefinitely. When the next test arrives, the outcome will depend less on ideology or intent than on whether the machinery still knows how to move as one. That is the real consequence zone. Not collapse, not takeover, but a slow erosion of collective action, hidden beneath the appearance of order. And once that erosion becomes visible, it is usually because it has already gone too far to correct quietly.